We have reported every day on efforts largely by Europe, some by the U.S., to put together security guarantees for Ukraine once the war against Russia is history. Pledges were made to Ukraine's President Zelensky of more weapons, air defense systems, and even troops. But all of this depends on a lasting ceasefire, and that ceasefire depends on two people seeing eye to eye, Ukrainian President Zelensky and Russian President Putin. So far, Putin continues to look the other way. I want you to listen to what the Russian Foreign Minister said on Friday.
So bottom line, there's no meeting planned.
President Putin said clearly that he is ready to meet, provided this meeting is really going to have an agenda, presidential agenda.
So that's a big if. There's no meeting planned, Mr. Foreign Minister. That's a big if. You're saying there's no meeting planned right now.
Kristen, I'm awfully sorry, you're not listening. There is no meeting planned, and I'm not challenging this. But you cannot, I think, understand what I am saying. Putin is ready to meet with Zelensky when the agenda would be ready for a summit. And this agenda is not ready at all.
So the official line from Russia, there is no agenda yet, so no negotiations for now. The European Union quickly rejected that thinking, the EU's top diplomat accusing the Kremlin of engaging in delaying tactics.
Well, it's still the same place where everybody except the Russians want peace. I mean, we see Europeans, Ukrainians, Americans wanting peace and doing all the diplomatic efforts to achieve that, whereas Russia is just dragging feet and not really giving any answers or actually playing games.
Well, I'm joined now by Alexander Gabuev. He's director of the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center. That's an organization that used to be part of the Carnegie Moscow Center until the Kremlin forced it to close back in 2022. His focus is foreign policy, especially the war in Ukraine. It's good to have you with us this evening. Let me just start by asking you, has Vladimir Putin, has he gotten an easy ride so far in attempts to bring him to the negotiating table?
I think that he's ready for a negotiation that's on his condition. His major leverage in driving the outcome that he wants, which is subjugation of Ukraine, is continuation of the war. But if the West and Ukraine are okay to offer him peace on his terms, he's ready to grab it. For now, he has secured that there are no additional penalties coming from Donald Trump, that Donald Trump is engaged in this dialogue with him, which just buys time for continued Russian offensive against Ukraine.
Yeah, you mentioned President Trump. He spoke today about the prospect of Putin and Zelensky sitting down for peace talks together. Take a listen to what he said.
We're going to see if Putin and Zelensky will be working together. You know, that's like oil and vinegar a little bit. They don't get along too well for obvious reasons, but we'll see. And then we'll see whether or not I would have to be there. I'd rather not. I'd rather have them have a meeting and see how they can do. But in the meantime, they continue to fight and they continue to kill people, which is very stupid.
So he says it's like mixing oil and vinegar. I mean, he does have a point, doesn't he? The two sides are so far apart, perhaps bilateral talks are impossible given their respective demands at the moment.
That's absolutely correct. Both sides' negotiation positions are very far from each other. Probably the closest moment that we had was in spring 2022, but that's water under the bridge now. And crucially, both sides still have resources to fight, and they believe that the other side is not necessarily winning to the extent that you are dragged into the negotiations and make some compromises. That's definitely what Vladimir Putin believes, and that's probably where President Zelensky also believes that with the current level of Western support, it's better still when this support is elevated, he can drag the time over where the Russian economy becomes increasingly problematic. Russia is short of the manpower it needs, and then Vladimir Putin will have to accept peace that is not ideal for Ukraine, that Ukraine can live with.
Well, Russia does have a point when it says that sanctions have not been a crippling force the way that they were predicted to be. I think the European Union is now talking about its 19th round of economic sanctions against Russia. The war rages on. I mean, when do we arrive at a consensus that the sanctions have failed?
The sanctions have not failed. The sanctions are not a silver bullet that will kill the Russian war machine quickly. That, I think, is very clear, and you need to balance the sanctions and the negative secondary order effects of the sanctions towards the global economy. For example, canceling buying of Russian oil and gas was nearly impossible in 2022 without disrupting Europeans' economy. So you had to take a longer phased out approach that allows Russia to adapt as well. But nevertheless, we see that growth in Russia is anemic, that its budget deficit is ballooning beyond the predictions. The sanctions are increasing transaction costs for Putin military machine. It cannot run it to the ground immediately, but it makes the persecution of this war increasingly costly for the Kremlin. And that's the benefit of keeping the sanctions and upgrading the sanctions pressure.
Okay, then take us into the mind of Vladimir Putin, if you would. What would bring him to the table to truly make an effort towards peace?
I don't have a crystal ball, so I cannot read his mind, obviously. I can say, but everything what we know about his negotiated position and something that he has articulated many times about those goals. These are really subjugation of Ukraine, not erasing it from the world's map, literally, but making it a puppet state similar to neighboring Belarus, right? And if that condition is given to him, he's happy to stop. So that's also peace on his conditions. Mm-hmm. If we are talking about peace that Ukraine can live with as a sovereign, independent state, then we are talking about two scenarios. Either Vladimir Putin just cannot persecute this war anymore because his economy is running out of money and he's running out of war material, particularly his soldiers, the manpower, or that the situation becomes so untenable that his own grip on power in Russia becomes under threat. And these two scenarios are linked. We are unfortunately very far from the moment where he cannot carry on his war of aggression. So keeping Ukraine in the fight requires a lot of investment from the Europeans, and keeping pressure on Putin also requires a lot of attention.
Okay, you say we're a long way, though, from being at a point where Russia breaks. So looking to your crystal ball with that, then, I mean, how much time are we talking about here? Are we talking about to the end of the decade or into the 2030s?
I think that our assessment is that the Russian economy and the manpower pool still has time for roughly 18 months to 24 months. And that's a dynamic assessment. It's not set in stone. The Russians are adapting, so the timeline is all the time shifting to the right. But we are talking about another year or so in which Ukraine needs to be kept in the fight and pressure needs to be maintained on Russia. However, once the guns fall silent in Ukraine, that doesn't mean that Putin's regime will be crumbling and defeated. Russia will go into rearmament, and it will continue to pose a threat to Europe that needs to be deterred. And you can maintain credible deterrence as throughout the Cold War, where Russia will be a threat, but it will not dare to invade Europe and NATO countries.
Alexander, we have seen time and time again that Vladimir Putin values the ability to threaten the use of nuclear weapons to push back Europe and the United States. Is it time for U.S. President Donald Trump to do some nuclear saber rattling of his own to push Putin towards peace?
He has done so. Unfortunately, that's a very dangerous game that Russia plays sort of well because it has an effect. But don't forget that Russia is a nuclear state with a vast arsenal that far outstrips anything that Europe has, and only balancer is the United States. If people believe that Vladimir Putin is pressed to the wall at the risk of losing his power and maybe freedom and life, and will not use nuclear weapon, I have some doubts. And so was the US intelligence community. The way that Team Biden has done it in coordination with President Zelensky and the Europeans is to push the Russian red lines all the time very carefully in a very well-organized fashion. And we've seen things like Ukrainian deep strikes into Russia or Ukrainian partial occupation of Russian Kursk region for several months that were absolutely unimaginable at the beginning of this war. So navigating this risk of catastrophic unfolding where Putin feels that he needs to use the most powerful tool that he has, and this incremental nature of denying Russian victory in Ukraine is the strategic challenge facing Western policymakers. And whether President Trump is fit to play this very sophisticated game, only time will tell.
Yeah, well, he's the only one who has the nuclear weapons to stand against the weapons of Vladimir Putin. Alexander Gabuev, it's good to have you on the program tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much.